The Honda generator coughed to life on the third pull, a hacking, metallic sound that tore a hole in the 4:30 in the morning quiet. The air, thick enough to chew, carried the trinity of swamp smells, the rich, dark rot of silt, the cloying sweetness of a water lily blooming somewhere in the dark, and now the acrid perfume of diesel exhaust. Derek Boudreau stood on the creaking porch of his stilt house, sipping black coffee laced with chicory from a chipped ceramic mug. The water below was a sheet of obsidian, a perfect mirror for the bruised purple of a sky waiting for a sun that was still miles away. This was his world, and for most of his life, it had been an ordered and honest one. You worked, you sweated, you respected the water, and the water, in its own grudging way, gave back. His eyes, accustomed to the gloom, scanned the Alumacraft tied to a pylon below. 16 feet of patched aluminum, its sides scarred with the stories of 1,000 encounters with cypress knees and submerged logs. The motor was an old 40-horsepower Evinrude, temperamental but faithful, like an aging dog that still had a good bark. Inside the boat lay the tools of his trade, extensions of his own hands. The long gaff hook with its wickedly sharp point. The bang stick, a short, brutal tool for the final necessary conversation with a gator, its brass casing tarnished from damp and use. His buck 119 knife, the blade worn thin from years of skinning, the handle molded to the shape of his palm. A red can of fuel and the big igloo cooler, already half full of ice that popped and settled with faint cracking sounds. His hands, calloused and sure, moved with the economy of long practice, checking the knots on his lines, expertly baiting the big-size 12-0 hooks with chunks of chicken that had gone slick and faintly iridescent with decay. The stink was part of the allure, a signal to the deep reptilian brain that a free meal was waiting. He tossed the baited hook into the boat where it landed with a wet slap. He pushed off from the dock, letting the Evinrude idle. He didn't just pilot the boat, he read the water. Every ripple and disturbance was a word in a language few people spoke anymore. A V-shaped wake cutting from the bank. Nutria. A sudden violent splash near the surface. A garfish, long and armored as a prehistoric reptile, chasing shiners. A slow burst of bubbles near the roots of a cypress. A loggerhead turtle taking a breath. But this morning something was off. The section of bayou he worked felt muted. He had not heard the usual raucous call of the egrets, and the few birds he did see cried with a frantic, anxious edge. The water itself was wrong. It was too still, too lazy, like a man sick with a fever. It lay flat and greasy, refusing the touch of the early breeze. The first line was taut. He cut the motor and hauled, the muscles in his back and shoulders bunching under his thin cotton shirt. An 8-footer surfaced, but it didn't come up thrashing, rolling in the violent, corkscrewing fury he expected. It just hung there, limp and defeated, its prehistoric eyes clouded over. It was the first real warning bell, the first sour note in the morning song. But he pushed the feeling away, chalking it up to the oppressive heat that had been squatting on the basin for weeks. He brought the boat alongside, the kill a practiced, almost regrettable motion. The short, sharp crack of the bang stick at the base of the skull. Heaving the gator's wet, immense weight over the gunwale was a grunt and curse affair. The dead weight settled in the bottom of the boat with a wet, final slap, its jaw hanging slack. Later, at the floating fuel dock, old Jimmy wiped his hands on an oily rag and gave him the bad news. The buyers in New Orleans were lowballing again. Price is down 20% on Hyde's share. Derek just nodded, the knot of unease tightening in his gut. He only sold the belly, the prime cut of leather. The rest, the meat, went to a little poor boy sandwich shack down the channel or into his own freezer. Every listless gator, every dip in the price, was another chip out of the thin wall between solvency and sinking. Back at the shack, the bloody ballet of processing began. He hoisted the carcass on a winch, the chain groaning a rusty complaint. The buckknife felt like a part of his hand as he made the precise, deep cuts to free the skin. The air filled with the coppery tang of blood, the heavy musk of the reptile, and the constant underlying scent of the river. He rolled the hide, flesh side out, and buried it in a mound of coarse salt in a plastic barrel. He butchered the meat with a heavy cleaver, the thuds echoing across the still water, each one a punctuation mark in a day's hard work. Part went into the cooler, the rest he set aside for supper. As the sun bled out across the horizon, painting the cypress trees in shades of orange and blood, he sat on his porch, cleaning his Remington 870 shotgun. It was a ritual, a comfort. The symphony of the swamp began its nightly performance. The full-throated chorus of bullfrogs, the electric thrum of cicadas, the distant questioning hoot of a barred owl. But tonight, a new instrument had joined the orchestra. Silence. A profound, watchful silence in the spaces between the sounds. A silence that was listening back. It was not the peace of an empty church. It was the quiet of a room you've just entered, where you know someone else is hiding. The next morning, the wrongness had a voice. Or rather, the lack of one. The second line he checked was slack. The thick, multi-strand steel leader was not gnawed through or snapped clean. It was wrenched, twisted into a grotesque metal corkscrew. The strands frayed out like a bomb had gone off inside the cable. It looked like someone had hooked it to the drive shaft of an industrial grinder and hit the power. He pulled on it, the metal biting into his palms even through his thick calluses. The line led down to a splintered nub. The wooden stake, a solid piece of 4x4 cypress he'd driven 6 feet into the mud and clay of the bayou floor with a sledge, had been broken off at the base. Derek stared at it, his mind refusing to process the sheer brutal force required to do that. He'd seen big gators, 20-footers some claimed, snap lines. But break a 6-foot stake, underwater clean off at the bottom? No. A gator thrashed, it rolled. It would have pulled the stake out of the mud, leaving a crater behind. This was a clean lateral snap, like a giant had karate-chopped a telephone pole. He killed the Evinrude, the sudden silence making the air feel even heavier. He drifted, scanning the shoreline. Thick black mud, a tangled mess of cypress roots bleeding into the water. No sign of another boat. No cleat marks from a winch. No churned-up mud from the tires of a 4-wheeled vehicle. Nothing. Just the swamp, watching him with its million green eyes. He poled the Alumacraft over to a similar stake he'd planted a few yards away. For a full minute he put his weight against it, pushing, pulling, rocking it. The stake groaned and sucked in the mud but didn't give an inch. It was part of the bayou floor now. It would take a sledgehammer or a mechanical advantage he could not fathom. His first thought was a monster bull gator, a king of the deeps, but he dismissed it. There was a raw, mindless power here, not the focused, predatory violence of an animal. It felt like something had just walked up to it and pushed it over. Less than a mile down the channel, he found two more. The same signature of destruction. Mangled leaders, broken stakes, the bait gone. This was not random. This was systematic. The slow-burning anger from yesterday's low prices began to curdle into a cold, prickling unease. This felt personal. Someone or something was deliberately tearing his livelihood apart, piece by piece, stake by stake. At the third savaged line set near a small mudflat that surfaced at low tide, he saw it. A print. It was blurred by the lapping water, but it was there. He beached the boat and knelt, the damp silt cold against his knees. It was not a bear. The shape was too long, too narrow. It was not a gator. There were no drag marks from a belly or a tail. It was not human. The digits, what he could make out of them, were too long, almost like fingers, and at the tip of each impression was a deep gouged scratch, a hole punched into the mud by a heavy claw. And the whole track was off. It was asymmetrical, canted to one side, as if the creature that made it had a limp or limbs of two different lengths. One side of the print was pressed deeper into the mud. It was a shape from a nightmare, something a child would draw after a fever dream. His mind scrambled for purchase on the sheer cliff of the impossible, grabbing for the most logical handhold. Poachers. Competitors trying to run him off his territory. He imagined a small barge with a winch and a grappling hook, but it made no sense. Why not just steal the gators? Why this theatrical, wasteful destruction? It was not the work of a professional trying to make a buck. It was the work of a vandal, a maniac. He stopped for gas at Thibodeau's marina later that day. The old Cajun was sitting on an overturned bucket, his gnarled fingers expertly mending a fishing net, the plastic shuttle flying back and forth. Derek, needing to say it out loud just to make it real, told him about the lines. Thibodeau stopped working. He looked up. His pale blue eyes faded by 70 years of sun and water. He spoke in that thick, syrupy mix of English and French that was dying out with his generation. "L'eau est malade, Derek," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "The water, she is sick. And when the water gets sick, she spits out the rougarou." Derek grunted and turned away, dismissing the old folk tale about a swamp werewolf. He was a man who believed in what he could see, what he could touch, what he could put in his crosshairs. Old Thibodeau was seeing boogeymen in the shadows. That night, sleep was a stranger. He sat in the dark of his shack, the Remington shotgun across his lap, its cold weight a small comfort. Every splash outside, every creak of the pylons sent a jolt through him. He'd locked his door for the first time in a decade. The image of that wrong-shaped print was burned into the back of his eyes. The swamp, his provider, his partner, had turned on him. It was keeping a secret, and he was beginning to think he didn't want to know what it was. He abandoned the lines. The routine, the familiar rhythm of his day, was shattered. This morning, he was not a trapper. He was a scout, a man patrolling the borders of his own invaded country. He kept the Evinrude at a low hum, hugging the cypress-lined banks, his eyes scanning for any sign of an intruder, any broken branch or muddy track that didn't belong. The swamp held its breath. The usual morning chatter of birds and insects was replaced by that same deep, listening silence from the night before. The water slid past the hull like oil. The whole world was waiting for something to break. He kept one hand near the butt of the holstered revolver on his hip, a gesture he hadn't made out on the water in 20 years. The feeling of being watched was a physical pressure against the back of his neck. He smelled it before he saw it. A scent carried on the thick, humid air, cutting through the usual odors of mud and decay. It was sweetish and deeply nauseating, the smell of meat gone very, very wrong, but with a sharp, unnatural chemical tang underneath it, like spoiled fruit and battery acid. It was a smell that did not belong here. It was the smell of industry, of waste. He turned the nose of the Illumicraft into the faint breeze, his gut clenching. He knew that smell. It was the smell of death, but a corrupted, tainted death. He found the source in a shallow cove choked with water hyacinth. A gator belly up, its pale, soft underside bloated and stark against the dark water. It was a monster, a true giant of the bayou, easily over 12 feet from snout to tail, a king dethroned, the kind of animal that commanded respect, even fear. An old bull he'd seen a dozen times over the years, a local legend, and it had been broken. Its spine was bent at a sickening, impossible angle, as if a giant had picked it up and snapped it over its knee. The force of it had pushed bone through the thick hide on its back. Derek cut the engine and drifted closer, the silence broken only by the buzzing of fat, green-bodied flies that rose in a shimmering cloud as he approached. The gator's tough, armored hide was shredded, not with bite marks from another gator, which were round and tearing. These were long, parallel gouges, deep furrows plowed through the scales and into the meat beneath, 4 or 5 at a time. Claws. The same kind of power that had snapped the cypress stakes had been unleashed here. But the most disturbing part was that the meat had not been eaten. The carcass was intact, save for the terrible wounds. This was not a predator killing for food. This was a slaughter born of a furious, mindless rage. For Derek, this was more than a ruined trapline or a financial loss. This was a violation, a desecration. In his world, the unwritten law was simple and absolute. You don't kill what you don't use. To waste a creature like this, a magnificent ancient beast, and leave it to rot was a profound insult. It was spitting in the face of the swamp itself. It was sacrilege. His cold unease finally ignited into a hard, cold rage. This was personal now, deeply personal. He pulled the boat closer, fighting a wave of nausea from the smell. As he examined the carcass, his anger was tinged with a new, chilling confusion. On the few patches of hide that weren't savaged, he saw something else. Strange, circular sores, ugly ulcers that looked like chemical burns. The skin around them was pale and necrotic, peeling away in slimy tatters. A thick, foamy slime, the color of dirty dishwater, oozed from the gator's gaping jaws, carrying that same chemical stench. He'd seen something like it before in small, unsettling flashes over the past few weeks. Dead fish floating on the surface, their scales peeling. Turtles he'd found on logs, their shells strangely soft, as if they were dissolving. At the time, they were just sad, isolated incidents, anomalies you chalked up to a bad year. Now, they were pieces of a puzzle he was starting to dread solving. This was no longer about a poacher. This was not about competition. This was about an imbalance, a sickness that had taken root in his water. He shoved the boat away from the floating corpse. The image of those weeping sores burned into his mind. He was done being a victim. He was done being confused. He turned the Illumicraft back toward his shack, the engine roaring at full throttle for the first time in days. The trapper was gone. In his place was a hunter. And he would track this thing, this disease, this rage-filled specter, to the gates of hell if he had to. He would find whatever did this and restore the balance. His balance. The tools of the trapper were put away. The gaff hook, the coils of steel leader, the bait bucket. They were symbols of a life that felt a lifetime away. A life of commerce and routine. Now he brought out the tools of the hunter. On the weathered wood of his porch, he laid out a canvas cloth and began the ritual. His Remington 870 Marine Magnum shotgun, its silver matte finish designed to resist the swamp's corrosive breath, was disassembled with practiced clicks and snaps. He cleaned every part with solvent and oil, the smell sharp and clean, a welcome antidote to the memory of rot. The smooth mechanical action of the pump was a comfort, a piece of solid, predictable reality in a world that had gone sideways. He lined up the ammunition with grim precision. Boxes of double-aught buckshot for close work, and a handful of heavy 1-ounce slugs that could stop a charging bear. Or something worse. From a long cloth-lined case under his cot, he retrieved his father's rifle. A Marlin 336, lever action, its walnut stock dark and smooth from decades of handling. His father had used it to hunt deer in the piney woods north of the basin. Derek hadn't fired it in years. It was an old gun, but cared for. Its action as slick as oiled glass. He wiped down the loopholed scope, polishing the lenses until the view of the cypress trees across the water was sharp enough to cut. For backup, he holstered his Ruger GP 100, a heavy Magnum revolver that felt as solid and dependable as an anvil in his hand. He did not know what he was hunting, not really, but a healthy dose of fear was a good quartermaster. It advised you to over-prepare. Fear kept you from getting lazy. Laziness got you killed. He spread a nautical chart of his territory across the small kitchen table. With a red grease pencil, he marked the locations, the 3 broken lines, the site of the slaughtered gator. They formed a distinct pattern, a cluster of violence in the western quadrant of his usual range. An area the old-timers called the Weeping Willow Maze, a tangled labyrinth of narrow channels and low-hanging trees where the water ran slow and dark. A place where the unwary got lost. He tried to think like the creature. Why there? Was it marking territory? Was it a hunting ground? A place to hide? He stared at the red marks, trying to will a strategy out of them. He packed what he called his vigil kit. A big steel thermos of the chicory coffee that was his lifeblood. A few pouches of beef jerky. His big Maglite flashlight, heavy enough to be used as a club, and powered by 4 large batteries. A Petzl headlamp for hands-free work. A rolled-up camouflage net. A bottle of military-grade insect repellent that smelled like poison, which felt appropriate. And his Steiner binoculars, the German optics so powerful you could count the whiskers on a nutria at 100 yards. The first night he set an ambush. He tucked the Illumicraft deep into a stand of thick cattails, the boat's drab olive paint melting into the shadows. He draped the camo net over himself and the boat, leaving just enough room to maneuver the Remington. Then he waited. The night was a long, slow eternity. Every sound was magnified, twisted by the darkness into a potential threat. The slap of a fish's tail sounded like a footstep. The rustle of a snake in the reeds sounded like something immense breathing. He sat motionless, the shotgun heavy across his knees, his senses stretched to the breaking point. Nothing came. Only the thick, oppressive weight of the waiting. The second night was a carbon copy of the first. Silence and anticipation. The swamp played a war of attrition with his nerves. Doubt began to creep in, a cold little worm wriggling in his gut. He was chasing an apparition, a figment of his own overworked, stressed-out mind. Fatigue was a heavy blanket, making his eyelids feel lined with lead. The swamp was testing him, seeing if he had the patience, the will to outlast it. He was poling out of the hiding spot at the gray edge of dawn on the third day, stiff and smelling of stale sweat and mosquito repellent when he saw it. Snagged on the thorns of a honey locust bush near the water's edge was a small tuft of hair. It was coarse, stiff as boar bristle and almost perfectly black. He knelt, his heart starting a slow, heavy drumbeat. He did not touch it. He leaned in close. And there it was, faint but unmistakable. The same sick, sweet chemical smell. The smell of the savaged gator. The smell of the disease. His doubt evaporated like mist in the morning sun. It was real. It was here. And it was close. The fog came in after midnight, thick and silent, a specter rolling off the water. It was a moonless night. The darkness so complete it felt like a physical weight. The ambush was not working. The thing was too smart, too wary, to blunder into a static position. Derek changed his tactics. No more waiting. Tonight, he would be the one moving. He killed the Evinrude a mile from the weeping willow maze and unshipped the oars. The oarlocks were wrapped in leather, and the oars slipped through the black water with only the faintest whisper and drip. He became a shadow gliding through a world of gray, featureless vapor. The fog deadened all sound, creating a false, intimate quiet. It swallowed the familiar shapes of the cypress trees, turning the bayou into an alien landscape of shifting walls and sudden, revealed clearings. His world had shrunk to a 50-foot circle of gray. He was deep in a narrow channel, the drooping fronds of willows brushing the sides of the Illumicraft like dead fingers, when he heard it. Ahead, maybe 50 yards, a heavy wet schlop, like a sack of wet cement being dropped into the water. It was followed by a sound that made the hair on his arms stand up. A thick, sucking, chugging noise. The sound of heavy feet slogging through deep, viscous mud. He froze, the oars trailing in the water. His heart, which had been a slow drum, was now a frantic hammering against his ribs. He held his breath, listening. The slogging stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was a listening silence. It knew something was there. He reached for the Petzl headlamp strapped to his forehead. His hand was not entirely steady. He took a deep, ragged breath, the damp, earthy fog filling his lungs. He flicked the switch. A powerful, focused beam of white light sliced through the fog. And it was there. It stood with its back to him, waist-deep in the murk. The shape was all wrong. It was unnaturally tall and gaunt, its limbs long and spidery connected to a narrow torso. There was no fur, just skin the color of wet cement, slick and glistening, draped with hanks of dark green algae and swamp muck. It was the shape of a drowned man who had been in the water for a very, very long time and had been stretched out on the rack. It was an anatomical impossibility, a thing stitched together from pieces that did not fit. Its shoulders were too wide for its hips, its arms too long for its body. Slowly, with a sound of grinding, popping cartilage that carried across the water, it turned its head. The head was nightmarish. A long, narrow snout like a wolf's, but utterly hairless, the gray skin stretched taut over the bone. There were no ears, just ridged cartilaginous nubs where ears should be. And the eyes. In the direct beam of his headlamp, they did not shine or reflect like an animal's. They glowed. A sick, dull, yellow-green phosphorescence. The eyes of a terminal patient. Eyes filled not with predatory fire, but with a universe of agony. Its mouth fell open, a black, wet cavern. It was not a roar or a snarl that came out. It was a sound of pure misery. A wet, bubbling, hacking cough that was torn from deep inside its chest, a sound thick with phlegm and pain. It saw the light. For a split second, a flicker of something, not rage, but sheer animal panic, flashed in those dying eyes. It flinched from the beam as if it had been struck. Before Derek's fumbling hands could raise the Remington from the bottom of the boat, the creature moved. It was not a lunge or a charge. It was an explosion of desperate speed. It scrambled sideways, its long limbs churning the water into a froth, and ran. It ran right across the surface of the water for a few impossible strides, its feet slapping the surface with loud cracks, before lunging into the thick curtain of trees and reeds on the far bank. There was a tremendous crash of breaking branches, a sound of violent passage, and then nothing. Just the ringing in his ears and the thick, suffocating silence of the fog, swirling into the space where the nightmare had been. He was alone again. But the world had changed forever. He sat there for a long time, the oar dripping, the only proof it had happened at all. He sat in the boat, adrift in the fog, the oars forgotten. The silence that rushed back in was louder than the creature's final crash through the undergrowth. The adrenal fire in his veins sputtered out, leaving behind a deep cellular cold that had nothing to do with the night air. His mind, the same practical, orderly mind that could field strip a motor or calculate the value of a hide, was reeling, trying to build a cage of logic around the thing he had just seen. A bear with mange, its fur fallen out, its body wasted by disease. That explained the skin, the gauntness, but not the glowing eyes, not the speed, and not the impossible run across the water. His mind threw up other possibilities, an escaped zoo animal, a tapir, an anteater, but the thoughts slid off the wall of what he'd witnessed, leaving no mark. The shape, the skin, the eyes, and the sound it had made. His swamp man's knowledge, the deep instinctual catalog of every living thing that walked, crawled, or swam in his territory, had a one-word answer for all his rationalizations: impossible. He fumbled with the starter cord for the Evinrude, his hands clumsy as a boy's. The motor caught with a roar that felt like sacrilege in the stunned quiet. He did not idle out of the channel. He gunned it, the Illumicraft slamming against the water, throwing up a wake that slapped hard against the banks. He ran for the shack as if the devil himself were on his tail. Inside, he slammed the door and threw the bolt, an action that felt both futile and absolutely necessary. He found the bottle of whiskey he kept for snake bites and emergencies and poured a quarter of a glass, his hand shaking so badly that amber liquid sloshed onto the floor. He saw his own reflection in the dark window pane, a pale, wide-eyed stranger staring back with a terror he had not felt since he was a child afraid of the dark. The rest of the night was a long, walking nightmare. He paced the floor of the small shack, from the cot to the stove and back again, the floorboards groaning under his restless weight. He was at war with himself. It was a hallucination. Swamp gas. I've been breathing it for days. It's the stress, the lack of sleep. But the evidence was too strong. The smell, the sound. The memory of those glowing, pain-filled eyes was seared onto his brain. He knew what he'd seen. The problem was, it could not exist. To accept it was to accept that the world was not the solid, knowable place he'd always believed it to be. It was to accept that there were things in the dark that had no names. By the time the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the window, the fear had begun to change. It was not gone, but it had undergone a strange alchemy, transmuting from base terror into something else, something hard and sharp. The primal, undeniable thrill of the hunt. He had seen something outside the pages of any book, beyond the scope of any biologist. He had looked upon the impossible, and now he could not let it go. It was a personal challenge, thrown down directly to him, Derek Boudreau, the man who thought he knew this water better than his own skin. His purpose shifted again. It was no longer about defending his traps or avenging a dead gator. It had become a pure, burning obsession. He had to know. He had to understand what that thing was. His goal was no longer to kill it, but to find it again, to study it, to prove to himself that he was not crazy. He had ceased to be a man protecting his land. He had become a naturalist on the trail of a species that had no name. He replayed the encounter in his mind, forcing himself past the fear to the details. The movements were fast but jerky, uncoordinated. The cough was a clear sign of respiratory distress, of sick lungs. The gaunt frame spoke of starvation or a wasting disease. It had not looked like an apex predator, a monster at the top of the food chain. It had looked like a victim. But a victim of what? He looked at his chart, at the red circles clustered around the weeping willow maze. He knew he had to go back in, deeper than before. He had to accept the impossible. Thibodeau's stories about the Rougarou no longer seemed like the ramblings of an old man. They felt like a map. Waiting in ambush was a fool's game. The creature was too wary, its senses too keen. It had sensed him in the fog, even when he was silent and downwind. He had to draw it out, force it into a place of his choosing. He needed bait. But after seeing its reaction to the dead gator, that senseless, hateful rage, he knew it was not hunting for food. He decided to use that rage. He would use the carcass of a freshly killed alligator not as a meal, but as an irritant, a provocation, a stink bomb of everything the creature seemed to hate, an effigy to be destroyed. The plan formed, cold and clear, in his mind. He chose the location with a sniper's eye, a small, muddy island in the middle of a wide, clear channel. It was sparsely vegetated with a few scraggly bushes, offering little cover. From the opposite bank, 70 yards away, a thick stand of cypress and Spanish moss offered a perfect concealed firing position. He spent the better part of the morning hauling a 7-foot alligator he'd taken earlier onto the center of the island, leaving a gruesome trail of blood and entrails from the water's edge. He propped its jaw open with a stick. The hot, still air quickly became thick with the coppery, metallic smell. A dinner bell for some, a declaration of war for another. He prepared his nest. On the opposing bank, he spread a canvas tarp to keep the damp from seeping into his bones and covered himself with the camouflage netting, blending into the background of bark and hanging moss. The Marlin 336 rested on its bipod, solid and steady. He dialed in the loopholed scope, the crosshairs sharp and black against the bright image of the bait island. He chambered around, the click of the lever action unnaturally loud. Then the waiting began again. But this was different. This was not the passive, hopeful waiting of a trapper. This was the patient, predatory stillness of a hunter over his kill zone. He became another stump, another shadow. The hours crawled by. The sun beat down and sweat dripped from his forehead onto the rifle stock. It came with the dusk. First, the sound he now knew so well, the heavy sucking splash as it entered the water from the far side of the island. Then a silhouette detaching itself from the reeds. It moved with a slow, cautious gait, its long head swinging from side to side, testing the air. It was a thing of sharp angles and unnatural motion, a living sketch of a nightmare. Its behavior was bizarre. It did not approach the gator carcass with the hunger of a predator. It circled it, its strange, loping gait both awkward and unnervingly fast. It lowered its head and sniffed at the corpse, and a low, wretched sound came from its chest, a miserable, keening whine. Then, in a sudden explosion of violence, it lunged. Its long, clawed hands tore at the gator's hide, not to eat, but to destroy. It ripped and shredded with a focused fury, as if trying to annihilate the very idea of the animal. It was not hunger. It was hatred. An instinctual, desperate attempt to eradicate something it perceived as a source of poison. And then it stopped. It froze mid-swipe, its body rigid. It raised its wolf-like head and looked, not around, not in his general direction, but at him. Across 70 yards of murky water and fading light, through the screen of moss and branches, it looked right at him. Its glowing eyes found the small, dark void of his hiding spot. It had sensed him. There was no more time. Derek let out a slow, controlled breath the way his father had taught him. The world narrowed to the circle of the scope. He settled the crosshairs on the creature's chest, a point just behind the shoulder of its long, spindly foreleg. He held it there, steady. The trigger was a thought, not a motion. The roar of the marlin shattered the evening peace. In the magnified view of the scope, he saw a puff of gray skin and dark fluid erupt from the creature's side. It threw its head back and let out a piercing shriek, a sound that was not animal, not human, but a terrifying fusion of pain, rage, and pure, abject surprise. It staggered, fell to one knee, then scrambled back to its feet. Trailing a dark stream behind it, it launched itself into the water with a desperate splash and vanished into the encroaching darkness. He'd hit it, but it was not dead. He did not move. The echo of the shot faded, replaced by the ringing in his own ears and the frantic chirping of startled insects. To go after a wounded animal in the dark, especially this animal, in its home territory, was not bravery. It was suicide. He remained in his sniper's nest, the marlin still hot in his hands, straining his ears against the curtain of night. For a long time there was nothing but the steady drone of the cicadas. Then, far off in the direction the creature had fled, he heard the sharp, distant crack of a heavy branch, followed by a faint, thrashing sound that quickly subsided into a gurgling wetness. Then the silence returned, deeper and more absolute than before. He lowered the rifle and took a long drink of cold coffee from his thermos. It tasted bitter. He would wait for the sun. As the first weak gray light filtered through the cypress canopy, he pushed the Illumicraft into the water. He poled across to the small island. The place where the creature had fallen was a grisly sight. The mud was soaked with a pool of blood that was not red, but a dark, viscous, blackish purple. It was thick, like crude oil, and glistened with a faint, iridescent sheen in the flat morning light. The chemical smell, the scent of sickness, rose from it, sharp and cloying, strong enough to make his eyes water. He had wounded it badly. The hunt began. He was a tracker now, a reader of the swamp's most brutal scripture. A broken reed, a smear of black blood on a broad palmetto leaf, a deep, clawed gouge in the mud where it had struggled for purchase. Each sign was a word, and together they spelled out a story of flight and pain. The trail led him away from the open channels and into the tangled guts of the swamp, deeper into the weeping willow maze than he had ever gone before. The channels narrowed, the canopy closed overhead, and the world became a green and brown tunnel. The landscape changed. He entered a place he'd only heard stories about, a place the old-timers called the Cypress Boneyard. Here ancient colossal trees stood like skeletal giants in stagnant black water that smelled of ages. Their massive, gnarled roots formed a labyrinth of narrow, dead-end passages. The air was still and suffocating, trapping the heat and the stench of decay. Sunlight struggled to pierce the gloom. It was a place that time had forgotten, a primordial pocket of the world. The pursuit became a grueling ordeal. He had to abandon the boat where a fallen log blocked a channel and continue on foot, wading through thigh-deep sucking muck that tried to pull his boots off with every step. The sun climbed, beating down on him, the humidity of physical presence. He was soaked in sweat, plagued by mosquitoes that swarmed his head in a whining cloud and running on fumes. The blood trail grew fainter. The splashes of black were now just small, infrequent droplets. The creature was weakening, bleeding out, but so was he. His own strength was seeping away into the grasping mud. The trail, what was left of it, led him to a small, unassuming island almost completely hidden behind a dense, weeping curtain of Spanish moss and willow branches. It was impenetrable, a solid wall of green and gray, but a single dark smear on a low-hanging frond, still wet, told him this was the place. He pushed the heavy, damp strands aside, the touch of them like a dead man's hair against his face, and he found it. Tucked beneath the massive, exposed roots of a giant 1,000-year-old cypress was a dark opening in the earth. A washout, a natural den. A concentrated wave of the disease smell, a stench of pus and rot and an old, settled death, wafted out from the darkness within. A last wet, black smear of blood marked the entrance. He stood before it. The Remington held at port arms, the pump-action shotgun feeling small and inadequate. He had tracked it to its home. He had found its lair. He stood at the mouth of the dark hole, a cold sweat breaking out on his neck. The smell alone was a physical barrier, a wall of rot. Every instinct, honed by a lifetime in a place full of things that could kill you, screamed at him to turn around, to get back in his boat and leave this cursed piece of water forever. But the obsession was a hook in his soul. It was stronger than fear. He had to see this through to the end. He clicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting a bright, wavering circle into the gloom. He racked the slide on the Remington, the shuck-shuck sound loud and profane in the silence. He took a breath that tasted of grave dirt and crawled inside. The lair was a small, damp cavern hollowed out by water and time, the air thick and close. The beam of his flashlight found the creature almost immediately. It was lying on its side on a crude bed of moss and damp leaves, one long clawed hand pressed against the ragged black-lipped wound in its flank. Its breathing was a terrible, shallow, rasping sound, a wet, rattling struggle for every bit of air. A death rattle. It no longer had the strength to make its coughing sound. It lifted its head, the movement slow and infinitely weary. It looked at him. The yellow-green glow of its eyes was faint now, like dying embers. And in them, he saw no rage, no malice, no threat. Only a bottomless exhaustion and a profound animal agony. It knew. It knew he was here to finish it. It watched him, its gaze steady, accepting. It had no fight left. It was just waiting for the final blow. Derek's finger was on the trigger, but he hesitated. His flashlight beam slid past the wounded creature and probed deeper into the shadows of the den. And then he saw the second one. It lay in the far corner, still and bloated. Its gray skin was a horrific patchwork of weeping, open sores and black-crusted scabs. Its limbs were stiff, its mouth locked in a silent snarl from which a line of dried, crusty foam trailed to the ground. The mud was soaked with a pool of blood that was not red, but a dark, viscous, blackish purple. It was thick, like crude oil, and glistened with a faint, iridescent sheen in the flat morning light. The chemical smell, the scent of sickness, rose from it, sharp and cloying, strong enough to make his eyes water. He had wounded it badly. The hunt began. He was a tracker now, a reader of the swamp's most brutal scripture. A broken reed, a smear of black blood on a broad palmetto leaf, a deep, clawed gouge in the mud where it had struggled for purchase. Each sign was a word, and together they spelled out a story of flight and pain. The trail led him away from the open channels and into the tangled guts of the swamp, deeper into the weeping willow maze than he had ever gone before. The channels narrowed, the canopy closed overhead, and the world became a green and brown tunnel. The landscape changed. He entered a place he'd only heard stories about, a place the old-timers called the Cypress Boneyard. Here ancient colossal trees stood like skeletal giants in stagnant black water that smelled of ages. Their massive, gnarled roots formed a labyrinth of narrow, dead-end passages. The air was still and suffocating, trapping the heat and the stench of decay. Sunlight struggled to pierce the gloom. It was a place that time had forgotten, a primordial pocket of the world. The pursuit became a grueling ordeal. He had to abandon the boat where a fallen log blocked a channel and continue on foot, wading through thigh-deep sucking muck that tried to pull his boots off with every step. The sun climbed, beating down on him, the humidity of physical presence. He was soaked in sweat, plagued by mosquitoes that swarmed his head in a whining cloud and running on fumes. The blood trail grew fainter. The splashes of black were now just small, infrequent droplets. The creature was weakening, bleeding out, but so was he. His own strength was seeping away into the grasping mud. The trail, what was left of it, led him to a small, unassuming island almost completely hidden behind a dense, weeping curtain of Spanish moss and willow branches. It was impenetrable, a solid wall of green and gray, but a single dark smear on a low-hanging frond, still wet, told him this was the place. He pushed the heavy, damp strands aside, the touch of them like a dead man's hair against his face, and he found it. Tucked beneath the massive, exposed roots of a giant 1,000-year-old cypress was a dark opening in the earth. A washout, a natural den. A concentrated wave of the disease smell, A stench of pus and rot and an old, settled death wafted out from the darkness within. A last wet, black smear of blood marked the entrance. He stood before it. The Remington held at port arms, the pump-action shotgun feeling small and inadequate. He had tracked it to its home. He had found its lair. He stood at the mouth of the dark hole, a cold sweat breaking out on his neck. The smell alone was a physical barrier, a wall of rot. Every instinct, honed by a lifetime in a place full of things that could kill you, screamed at him to turn around, to get back in his boat and leave this cursed piece of water forever. But the obsession was a hook in his soul. It was stronger than fear. He had to see this through to the end. He clicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting a bright, wavering circle into the gloom. He racked the slide on the Remington, the shuck-shuck sound loud and profane in the silence. He took a breath that tasted of grave dirt and crawled inside. The lair was a small, damp cavern hollowed out by water and time, the air thick and close. The beam of his flashlight found the creature almost immediately. It was lying on its side on a crude bed of moss and damp leaves, one long, clawed hand pressed against the ragged, black-lipped wound in its flank. Its breathing was a terrible, shallow, rasping sound, a wet, rattling struggle for every bit of air. A death rattle. It no longer had the strength to make its coughing sound. It lifted its head, the movement slow and infinitely weary. It looked at him. The yellow-green glow of its eyes was faint now, like dying embers. And in them, he saw no rage, no malice, no threat. Only a bottomless exhaustion and a profound, animal agony. It knew. It knew he was here to finish it. It watched him, its gaze steady, accepting. It had no fight left. It was just waiting for the final blow. Derek's finger was on the trigger, but he hesitated. His flashlight beam slid past the wounded creature and probed deeper into the shadows of the den. And then he saw the second one. It lay in the far corner, still and bloated. Its gray skin was a horrific patchwork of weeping, open sores and black-crusted scabs. Its limbs were stiff, its mouth locked in a silent snarl from which a line of dried, crusty foam trailed to the ground. The smell of rot and chemicals was overwhelming here, coming off this second body in waves. It was a female, or had been. There was not much left of it but a shell of disease. She had been dead for days. He took a step closer, his boots squelching in the mud, his mind struggling to connect the dots, the sores. The weeping ulcers on the dead female's hide were identical to the ones he'd seen on the slaughtered 12-foot gator. The same as the ones on the dead fish he'd been finding for weeks, the turtles with shells as soft as old leather. And the truth hit him. It was not a thought, but a physical blow. A stunning, brutal revelation that left him breathless. The gators. The turtles. The fish. The creature he'd been hunting had not been the aggressor. It had been acting as a scavenger, a janitor of the swamp. It had been following a primal, desperate instinct to eradicate a sickness it could feel spreading through its world. The dead female, his mate, had died from this poison. And he, the male, had been lashing out at every other sick animal he found, trying to scrub the world clean. It was not killing for malice. It was killing out of a panicked, instinctual drive to destroy the carriers of a poison it could not understand. Its rage was not evil. It was the frantic, pained response of an organism trying to fight off an infection. He looked from the dead female to the dying male, then back again. They were not invading his world. They were desperately trying to save their own. But their home, their food, the very water they drank and the air they breathed, it had all turned to poison. They were trapped. They were the original victims. And he, with his traps and his guns, had just been another symptom of their terminal illness. The monster was real, but he'd been aiming his gun in the wrong direction the whole time. The wounded creature on the floor let out a sound. It was not the shriek of the shooting or the wet cough of its sickness. It was a low, mournful, keening sound that seemed to go on forever, a noise that started deep in its chest and unspooled into the close, damp air of the lair. It looked at the body of its dead mate, then its dying eyes found Derek's. It was not the sound of a monster. It was a lament, a cry of grief for its lost partner and its poisoned, ruined world. The sound went right through Derek, bypassing his ears and settling cold and heavy in his bones. A wave of sudden, violent nausea washed over him. His head felt light and foggy, and a distinct, sharp, metallic taste bloomed on his tongue, like he'd been sucking on a mouthful of old pennies. He tried to shake it off, blaming it on the stench, the exhaustion, the dehydration, just the body rebelling after a long, hard hunt. That's all it was. He felt a sudden dizziness and put a hand against the earthen wall to steady himself. He lowered the flashlight, his gaze falling on his own hands. They were caked with mud and streaked with the creature's black blood. He'd been wading in this water for hours, breathing its vapors, absorbing it through his skin. On the back of his left hand, just below the knuckles, he saw a small reddish patch of skin. He had not noticed it before. It did not itch. It did not burn. He poked it with a finger from his right hand. The skin was numb, unresponsive, like a piece of meat. The realization did not creep up on him. It fell like a hammer, like a tree crashing down in a silent forest. He had not just found the creature's lair. He had walked into the epicenter of the contamination. He had submerged himself in it. The water he'd made coffee with, the mist he'd breathed, the muck he'd waded through for hours, the slow, invisible poison that had killed the female, that was killing the male, that had turned the gators into frantic agents of destruction. It was in him now. It had been seeping into him all day. His own worn-out, sleep-deprived body had not stood a chance against it. His strength left him in a sudden, boneless rush. His legs buckled. He sagged against the damp earthen wall of the den, the Remington slipping from his nerveless fingers and landing with a soft thud in the mud. He looked across the small, dark space at the dying creature. And for the first time in his life, staring at something so alien, he did not feel fear or hatred or even pity. He felt a horrifying, twisted kinship. They were both predators, both masters of their small corners of the world, both stubborn and territorial. And both had been caught in the same invisible, merciless trap, laid by an enemy they could not fight, because they could not see it. Through the narrow entrance of the den, past the curtain of willows, he could see a faint, hazy glow on the far horizon. A smear of sick orange against the darkening sky. The lights of the Petrochem Solutions plant miles upriver. The source, faceless, indifferent, and a world away. The true monster, pumping its slow, quiet death into the water day after day, year after year. He lay in the half-light of the dying day, listening. His own breathing was becoming labored, catching in his throat with a sound that was disturbingly familiar. A wet, rasping wheeze. It mingled with the shallow, ragged breaths of the creature opposite him. In the gloom of the cypress root den, the two sounds merged, becoming one. A shared, final, rattling chorus. They were the last two witnesses to a crime that would have no investigation, a murder with no body to find. The only question left was not which one of them would die first. It was whether anyone would ever notice they were gone.